Welcome to the podcast for documentation standards according to the College of Nurses of Ontario. So by definition, documentation is anything that we either write on paper or that we document using a computer, and it describes the status of the patient or the care that was given to the patient and then the response following. And we'll see momentarily that sometimes a patient is a single person or sometimes it is a cohort group that we are teaching. So why is it that we document? Number one is it's mandated by the law. The Regulated Health Professions Act states that we have to document all of the care that we give and that we have to document from the patient's perspective, and it says that we have to document the actions and the responses. But our documentation is reviewed by other healthcare professionals, other nurses, physicians, speech-language pathologists, physiotherapists, to see what a patient was like previously, especially when something new crops up. They want to figure out how long that has been, such as maybe crackles in that left basin now that it's expanded up to the left mid-lobe as well. It also holds us accountable for our actions. What did we see during our shift? What did we do during our shift, etc.? Many research studies are actually retrospective studies. That is, that they're looking back. So they look at documentation and they follow a set cohort, such as what was the outcome of people when they entered the emergency room with fractured hip versus being admitted from their family doctor, and that they look back on all of the charting for those individuals and they're looking for the markers of whatever the research study is looking at. Much of the funding that we get from the government is supported by our charting as far as how much care is required to give a certain type of patient load and how many types of those patients that we have on average, etc. And then quite often we are always looking to improve the care that we're giving, and they look back on charting to see how often that something was or wasn't done. So there are many different reasons why we chart, and so it's very important that we do so accurately. Review the actual documentation standard that is set out by the College of Nurses of Ontario as posted on Blackboard. There will be a paper copy that is handed out in class, and you will note some of the core standards that come through, but our documentation needs to be clear, concise, comprehensive. So we want to use concrete words that paint a picture. You want to use as few number of words as possible, because if you're reviewing charting, you don't want to review a whole page and a half. If you can say the same thing in a quarter page, perfect. And it has to be complete. It has to tell the whole story. What you document by law has to be accurate and true. You cannot document something that you are not seeing, something that is false. You can be held legally accountable, and that might be something that you, if found out, that you perhaps would have your license taken away, because that is a core standard that you must document what you see and you cannot falsify documentations. Whenever we document, because we want it to be clear, concise, and comprehensive, also has to be relevant to the task. For instance, and what is relevant for one patient can be not so relevant for another patient. For instance, if I am being admitted and I've got nothing wrong with my mental faculties, the fact that I've got a young grandson that is visiting with me and we are playing a game of Monopoly, I would just document that I had visitors for that person. However, if I'd had a stroke or I had dementia and or delirium and I wasn't cognitively able to play a board game, and now I am. Now it is relevant, not just that I have a visitor, but also that I'm playing a board game and how I am doing within that board game. Relevant. You have to be able to reflect your observations. So what am I seeing accurately? Try not to judge. We will have some examples coming up with examples of being summative about somebody being angry and aggressive, and actual observations. And that's what we want, is the actual observations. We don't want judgments. We want to complete our charting as soon as possible. Quite often you can't get right to the computer right away or right to pen and paper right away, but as soon as possible, because other people are needing to look back and they may come up in between and they want to see how the person has been for the day. And chronological. That means that we're going to be charting in the order that it was done. If it's been a really busy day and I don't sit down till 2 o'clock, hopefully that's not happening on every shift. If it is, by the way, you need to reevaluate. But if that were the case, I would not be charting what I saw at noon, and then what I saw at 7, and then what I charted at 11, and then what I charted at 8. It would go in chronological order from first of the day to current. So core standards, again, clear, concise, comprehensive, accurate and true, relevant, reflect observations, timely, and chronological. Additional standards to follow include that it needs to be legible and non-erasable. So this means that if the document is a permanent document, such as a progress note, we're going to document in ink. And typically, the facilities will institute that if you are documenting pen and paper, you're using black ink because it's easier to photocopy. It comes out more clearly. If it is a non-permanent document, like many nursing care plans or worksheets are not permanent, then it doesn't matter if you use a pencil. But if it's part of the permanent document, it has to be pen, and it cannot be an erasable pen. And again, typically black because it's easier to view when you photocopy it. According to the law, it stipulates how long that we have to maintain our documents, and we'll talk more about how long towards the end of this slide. But you have to be able to, whoever is the holder or the organization needs to make sure that all documents are kept and that they are retrievable in case of a lawsuit or for whatever other reasons, that they're, again, looking back for retrospective studies. You have to be able to make your charts accessible. And you won't have to worry about that unless you start your own company, such as for a foot care. And according to, again, the law, the Personal Health Information Protection Act, PIPA for short, says that all of our charting needs to be made confidential. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future when we have our legal and ethical lectures. And all of our charting needs to be, lastly, client focused. So we are not charting about what we have done and what we're about to do and how that made us feel and our responses after we did the treatment. It's all about the patient, our observations, what we see, the subjective data that our patients are reporting to us, our follow-up actions after we saw that data and had that information, and then again, responses, client focus. How did the patient respond to that treatment, etc., etc. So to recap, additional core standards are that it's legible and non-erasable, it's permanent and retrievable, it's confidential, and it is client-focused. If you were to review the College of Nurses documentation standards, some other key components that your documentation must have is that it has to begin with the date and the time that you are actually sitting down to write. And that is because if you are writing shortly after the event has occurred, you are more likely to remember accurately what happened than if you're sitting down 8 hours later. And so that they also want to know the date and the time of the event. At the Health Alliance, their paper documentation forms in the past had carried one column for the date and the time of the entry and another column for the date and the time of the event. Other facilities only have one column, and that would be then the date and the time of the entry. And so in my note, I need to reflect the date and the time of the event. Always at the end of your note, and only at the end of your note, you are going to sign it and you are going to write your designation. Is this a student that is making this entry? Is it a registered nurse? Is it a registered practical nurse? Is it a nurse practitioner? Is it a physiotherapist? Who is writing this note? So as a student nurse in the practical nurse program, in your very first year, your designation, if you were to do paper documentation, is SPN1. We also want to make sure that we are using descriptive, meaningful phrases. When you use phrases like had a good night or up and about, the next person that comes to read it is not really sure what it is that you meant, and they have to kind of put some conjecture into it. However, if you say they had a good night, and what you really mean is that they slept the entire shift, then write slept the entire shift. We can't leave any blank spaces in our nursing notes, and that is for legal reasons. When there are blank spaces, then other people or yourself are able to, in the future, when something bad happens, go back and modify your charting by adding things. So to prevent that and to make sure that the notes, when they are brought into court, are not questioned as being modified or falsified, the College of Nurses specifies that there can be no blank spaces. So if you are finishing a section of your charting, and for instance the data, and now you're writing your assessments, and there's still half a line left on the data, you want to put a blank, you want to put just a straight line through any blank spaces so that nobody can go in and add. Now, I'm not sure about you, but when I become fatigued, sometimes things flow out of my pen that I didn't intend them. My brain was cloudy. I just wasn't thinking straight. And when I look back over, I realize that I've charted the wrong word or I've charted on the wrong patient. So most errors are innocent errors. However, if you want to ensure that when it gets to court, if it happens to get to court, those innocent errors don't look suspicious, errors need to remain visible. And so in order to keep an error visible, you just put a single straight line through it so you can still read the word, and then you write error above it and put your initials. That way they know it's you that decided that that was an error and that it was an innocent error. You never want to use whiteout because you can see that whiteout was used and then it makes it look suspicious. And you can never ever delete or alter somebody else's charting. If you notice that they've documented the wound on the wrong arm or an IV on the wrong arm, contact them at home, and in their next shift, only they can come in to correct the error. You always have to think about how do things appear if they were to appear in court. Recall one of our core standards is that it is client-centered, and so we want to include subjective data that our patient is reporting to us. So we can include that in our data, such as the client shared how upset that they were about the test results, or sometimes there's significant words that we want to get out so people don't think that we're making judgments. So if the client said she was afraid, that may be a keyword that you put in quotation marks, and then specifically what they're afraid about won't be able to manage at home. Now it's clear and concise that that is exactly how the patient is feeling. In addition to subjective data, we also want to include some objective data. So objective data is anything that you can see or measure, or anybody else could see or measure the same thing, that the skin is red and itchy, that the incision is 10 inches long, etc. And we want to use facts. We don't want to use judgments. So the client appears aggressive would be a judgment. And then that might mean something different to other people, to different people. But if I said instead, using objective observed data, that the client is pacing, shaking fists, and yelling obscenities, now somebody's able to paint a clear picture exactly what is going on, and they can draw from it what is happening. They can draw their own conclusions. So appears and seems are judgment words. Try using some words that you're actually seeing. So in addition to our objective data, we also need to list our nursing actions and the client's responses. The end of part 1.